You're listening to The Switch. The Switch is a podcast about ideas and experiences that change our minds. I'm your host, Chase Harris, joined, as always, for this discussion by my co-host, Alex Berner. This week, week 4 of Outwitting the Devil. Principle: analyze temporary defeat, no matter of what nature or cause, and extract from it the seed of an equivalent advantage. Now we start off the episode with a quick recap of Outwitting the Devil, followed by feedback from the exercise from last week, week 3. Then we'll jump into week 4, discuss the principle, move into the exercise, and ultimately end when the breakout rooms start. This podcast is hosted by 52 Living Ideas. It is a meetup group, meets all week. If you'd like to be part of this discussion or any of the other discussions, the link is in the description or show notes. We are also a Patreon-funded podcast. If you like the work that we do here, by no means is it necessary. However, you can support us by going over to patreon.com/switch_podcast. And occasionally we put out bonus content like bonus interviews, discussions with audience, things like that. So feel free to head over there and support us for as little as $1 per episode. This podcast is produced by Mojo Filter Media. That's our audio company. We specialize in audio production for interactive media, video games, sound design, art projects, things like that. Even if you just need your music produced by people with good ears and good mixing technique, head on over. Check out our stuff. Let us know what you think. Drop us a line. Anyway, without further delay, this week's podcast, week 4, Outwitting the Devil. This is week 4 of Outwitting the Devil, and as always, I'm going to do my best to do like a 60-second summary of the book. For anybody who's joining us for the first time, here's how it's going to go. I'll give a summary of the book, and then last week, the audience was tasked with an exercise, and actually Alex and I completed it too. So we were all tasked with an exercise that was supposed to focus in on one of the principles from this book. And then after we sort of recap and talk about the exercise, we will get into this week's principle, as well as an exercise for this week. Now, principles, exercises, why is all that important? Here's why. Outwitting the Devil was written by Napoleon Hill. He wrote Think and Grow Rich. It's a pretty famous book, sort of launched the self-development book genre. And he also wrote this book, Outwitting the Devil, which, in contrast to Think and Grow Rich, which was sort of more about the paths to success, Outwitting the Devil elucidates the paths to failure, and more specifically, and more importantly in my mind, the paths away from failure and into success. Now, it's framed as a conversation between the devil and Mr. Earthbound, who is Napoleon Hill. And in the conversation, the devil talks about all the ways that he causes people to do what he calls drifting. And that is drifting away from your goals, drifting away from your ideal self, drifting away from what you want from life and into discontent, into, sort of things you don't want from life. There are many mechanisms that he uses to do this to people. He talks about taking advantage of their natural desires and leading them astray. He talks about distracting them with things that seem appealing, in an expedient manner, and the meaningful stuff goes by the wayside. He talks about all these things. But he also talks about the principles that help you become a non-drifter. And that's what we're going through in these 12 weeks. We've got 11 principles for how to ensure that you are not drifting in life. And so last week's principle was decide definitely what you want from life. Then create a plan for attaining it and be willing to sacrifice everything else if necessary, rather than accept permanent defeat. Now, the exercise for last week was to describe in detail your ideal self. And we gave some ways to do that because that's a tall task. And then identify the gap between you and that person. The thought being, at some point, you will become your future self, whether it's ideal or not, that's sort of up to you. But you do theoretically have this ideal self, and there's a gap between you and your ideal self. What does that gap look like? Why are you not your ideal self today? And then step 3 was identify the steps that you need to take to close that gap and what you might need to sacrifice in order to achieve your ideal self. Now, again, we had a deep conversation about that subject last week, and Alex and I are going to start by talking about our experiences with the exercise, and then we'll open it up to you. For anybody who was here last week or who read the description and did the exercise from last week, the one that I just described, please put in the chat if you're willing to spend 2 minutes giving us your takeaways from the exercise. And then when Alex and I are done, we'll go ahead and call on you. We'll hit, 2, 3 people, depends on how the discussion goes, because this week we've got a whole new principle and a whole new exercise to talk about. So if you're new here, sit tight. You're going to hear about the cool stuff that happens after you embody these principles. You're going to hear about what it's like to go through these exercises from some people, and we're going to move on to the next principle. So, Alex, can you start us off? What was your experience with doing the exercise from last week? And maybe if you want to give us any of the description of your ideal self that you came up with, as much as you would like to share.
Yeah, thanks, Chase. So I answered this in a little bit more of a theoretical way than outlining specific, for example, goals. Because I feel like these goals that I project, that I want, always shift in time, and that's not the unchanging future self that I want. I don't know if in 10 years I'm going to want to be doing the same career goal, but I do know what type of person I'll want to be. And I think I wrote out my ideal self is in some ways no different from my current self. If I had to list the traits that I want, I think I already have them, but the difference is in consistency. I want to reliably display my best traits to myself and others. I want to be able to call upon my most compassionate self, which is already inside me, whenever it serves the needs of myself and others. I want to be able to conjure my energetic drive for creativity whenever it would be of value. My ability to listen to others and develop wisdom whenever that's needed. I want to exude positivity on a consistent basis and not just when things are going well for me. I want to always find joy in others people's success and find the ability to not see arbitrary boundaries between me and the rest of the world. And through my habits, I've touched on and started to develop all of these traits. But I think they're still somewhat foreign. They don't have a totally innate and natural feel necessarily. Some of them more than others, but some I know will take more work. And I'll likely always fall prey to drifting habits at some point or another. And to be honest, my ideal self still would occasionally, although very rarely, fall into those habits, because I do think that those are such an important learning experience for me. And something like when I have a moment of failure, or I do something I'm not proud of, or I go through a really hard time, that's what knocks me out of a rut or stagnation or drifting, whatever it is, and it really motivates me to live with right action. So I think to get there, it's partially by continuing to do what I've already done, the habits that I've seen start to bring me to this ideal self, and to cultivate the right community, the people around me who will help to cultivate these traits and keep the traits that I already have, and basically just continue not drifting, and especially when we're thinking of in terms of this book, thinking about it from the not doing the bad thing and sticking with the, not necessarily having it to be perfect all the time, but as long as I'm not getting worse, I'm, it's like if you're thinking of a slope, it's going to be somewhere in there, even if it's going up very slowly. That's okay. Sometimes it's going to be going up higher. I just don't want to be going down.
So I have at least one question for you. I think I mean, it sounds like you've solidified, or you're able to describe in actually pretty good detail a lot of the more like trait side of things, the character side of things. One of the ways that I think helps some people, and maybe not everybody, uh, achieve certain character traits and things like that, is to materialize and metricize those things. Is that in any way how you operate? I mean, if not, this is totally cool. But if you've noticed that metricizing things helps you, can you think of any way to do that for the ideal future Alex that you've just described?
I don't know about metricizing the behaviors themselves, but I do metricize the habits that
Okay.
cultivate those. You
Can you
know,
talk about any of the metrics for that?
so for example, meditation. That's something that has led me always in a positive direction that I want my ideal self to have. And I don't know what that will bring, but I know that's a habit of my ideal self. So let's say a week. Let's say I haven't meditated at all for a year, right? Let's take a big chunk of time. To me, it's just finding a metric that is now better than none a year, right? Obviously, I want to do a lot better than that, but leading myself through. I mean, yeah, I guess it's pretty simple. Just doing it more than I did the week before. That just the principle of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
As far as the other things, I mean, I'm trying to think like I wouldn't know how to necessarily quantify or metricize something like finding joy in somebody else's success,
Mm.
right? Like I guess it would be a yes or no type thing, and just hopefully end up more with the yes than the no.
Yeah. Yeah. I was going to say, I think if you were asking me the question, how do I quantify something like that? I would say something like your journaling habit is already a way to measure that, and a way to reflect on, are you finding joy? I mean, you can even just like add that in every day and have, as much as it is a subjective metric, it's still a metric. It's still quantifying something. So, that's always an option.
Yeah, for sure.
Cool.
Yeah, and just to be specific, the traits, the habits that I think have gotten me here are meditation, journaling, exercise, helping others, and just really making the most of my time. So,
Nice. Awesome. All right, cool. I'll talk about mine real quick. So I kind of started at the other end. There's this idea that I actually heard from Shrikant at one point of creative analytical shuttling, which I think is a really good tool for certain processes. And I think while I think Alex's ended up being a description more on the side that fits well into a prose description, it's sort of a more subjective, almost feeling oriented description. I tried to focus on like almost a character sheet, D&D character sheet style description. And I mean, maybe they don't totally fit into those categories. That's just what my subconscious fed me to try to explain it. So, for things on mine, I have things like, what am I going to be doing occupation wise? What is my net worth? What is my ideal weight? What are my habits and routines? Like down to numbers. And, what am I doing daily? What am I doing weekly? What kinds of food am I eating? How much am I reading? How much am I meditating? How much am I exercising? What kind of exercise? Like I tried to get really granular in those details and put as many numbers and rates and things like that as I could. And I also ended up with this giant list of traits and skills, and I was trying to sort through them. Unfortunately, I did not have time to fully sort through them, but I think they fall into a couple of categories that almost branch out hierarchically. And maybe what I'll do is I'll sort them on my own and post that, or we can talk about it at a future date. But just to pick out a few, I pulled some categories from some characters for example, if anybody's seen the TV show The Unit, that is my favorite TV show. And the character Bob Brown in there, he is brave. He's dedicated to his mission and his team. He's a family man. And those are things that I admire, that I think I would like to be able to describe my ideal future self under those terms. Um, Pulling from some other characters and situations, I ended up with traits and things like mindful, articulate, disciplined, equanimous, virtuous, interested in deep understanding of people and ideas, emotionally strong and supportive, financially stable, expert in my craft. And these things, they fall into several different categories, but I have them in a big list now. So I think for me, the exercise felt like a great first step. I don't feel done. I feel like this document needs to evolve and it needs to transform over time. And I think the big indicator for me that that's the case is that I didn't get a good grasp on steps 2 and 3. I didn't feel like I could actually identify the gap very well between where I am now and where I am then, other than like really obvious things. So like, for example, my ideal future self is ambitious. How ambitious? I don't know. Am I being ambitious in an ideal way now, or do I need to be more ambitious? That's a good question. My sense is that I need to be more ambitious, but I want to know more about that gap. And at the same time, I don't want to get stuck over analyzing because I want to, lead into action. But those are sort of my thoughts from it. I felt like it was a helpful exercise, but it just felt like a first step. It didn't feel like, it almost didn't feel like enough.
Yeah, I agree with that for sure. I like how you broke it down into more kind of tangible, adjectives and descriptors. I agree it doesn't feel like enough because especially I think mine is a little bit too vague, but it also I think will last longer. Does that make sense? So I think a lot of when I think about the specifics of when I go into specifics, I think that's probably more useful day to day in thinking like I am this type of person.
Yeah.
Because that's what I think. I think when I think I am creative or something, it's like that will help me just not worry and judge what I'm creating because I just have that assumption and I flow with it. For me, the more kind of specific stuff, that's what I really use my journal for because like you said, it evolves, it changes day to day and it's an ongoing document. And I think one of the reasons I wrote it like this is because I have such a predisposition to quantify and find those type of things. And I've had varying success with that method. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's get some feedback from some people. First up, we've got Joe, followed by Steven. So Joe, let us know your experience and what you got from it.
So I'll be very brief. I broke it down into 2 categories. In the categories that I broke them down into were how I interact with others, and then what are my goals. And I kind of saw some links between the idea of self-care and how that actually impacted how I interacted with others. So one of the examples was, how I interact with others. I had underneath there the idea of ethics, helping others, caring for others, and some of the self-care things that I have under myself is that maintaining my composure kind of impacts that. Maintaining my emotions impacts how I interact with others. And then I actually did think about some of the metrics as far as, my ideal self too, it's some of the things that you guys have already said. You talked about the idea of, and one other thing that I measured how it impacts, there's a crossover, is the idea of self-compassion and how that impacts how I interact with others as well. So some of these metrics that I have actually directly impact how I interact with everyone else. And that's a really important thing that I noticed, because then I could start to develop specific tasks that kind of answers both categories. And meditation being one of those, healthy being exercising. And yes, I too am not complete with my list or my plan, but this has given me a really good framework and a starting place. I mean, some of these things are are going to be a little bit difficult to come up with metrics, but one of them is just become a little bit more faster in my reading and become a little bit more productive. So how I measure that is actually a bit of a challenge, because depending if I'm taking on like Maps of Meaning as a book versus some other book, it really doesn't measure. Like I can't say I read this many books or I did this many things, because have to start to account for the difficulty of the tasks that I'm taking on. So that's where I ran into a little bit of difficulty, is developing some specific metrics that account for the level of challenges that I'm taking on. But this gave me it was very therapeutic for me, I can say. And it really helped me outline some of my emotions that I can account for in my journal, that would actually directly impact how I interact with others. So if I got angry a number of times in the day, that directly impacts not only me, but it also impacts how I interact with other people. And that's a way of prioritizing it. Like I can't do that. So, because, one of my top goals again is, the idea of helping others. And so with that, I kind of see the connection between self-care and my interactions with others. So I'll leave it at that.
Awesome. Thank you, Joe. All right, Stephen, you are up.
Hello. So I wasn't too sure if I was going to share, but then after listening to you, Alex, I can really relate to what you were saying and think of my...
Stephen, could you speak into the mic? We're barely able to hear you.
Oh, sorry, I had to turn up my volume. Is that better? Okay, so Alex, what you had to say resonated with me because I too feel like I'm my ideal self. And rather than thinking of it as my ideal self, Napoleon Hill refers to our other self. And perhaps that's what you're talking about here. And it's not necessarily something that doesn't exist within us, but is already part of us and we have to acknowledge. So, and of course, I'm always trying to improve and how I can be better. And I do that, fill the gap, as you would say, through meditation and other things. But at first, I approached the exercise as trying to think of people that I admire. And the two people that came to mind were Dave Chappelle, who hosted last Saturday night's SNL, and Barack Obama, maybe because they're in the news now on TV. But I admire them for their confidence and intelligence, especially in the way they present themselves verbally. Dave Chappelle admitted in his monologue that he was scared and nervous, and whether that's really true or not, I'm not too sure. After all, he's a comedian, and perhaps he was joking. And he's also much taller and bigger than me. So when thinking about the gap between who I strive to be, sometimes I think, well, you can't carry yourself like that unless you are really big and tall, though Obama isn't necessarily, so that's not necessarily the case. And I, like most people, have self-doubt, and that's normal. One can strive to be their ideal self, but sometimes those, well, okay, now I'm thinking, maybe the ideal, you have to realize what the ideal is, because sometimes it's not attainable if it is to be as well known as either those two people or whoever it might be. So that's what I have to say.
Awesome. Thank you, Stephen. That makes me think that I want to repeat a point that I started to make last week, but that I think is worth making again. And that is that the point of understanding or coming to know your ideal future self isn't to shoot for something that you think you can achieve. That's like I was listening to a podcast called The Unraveling, and they were talking about how when the United States invaded Iraq, and there were, in the initial invasion, there were people like all over waving American flags. And then at some point, the Al-Qaeda made some move that sort of took back some territory, and all of a sudden people threw their flags away. And even when the American troops came back into that territory, the people weren't waving the flags, because it wasn't that the people were happy necessarily that Americans were there. They were betting on who they thought would win. And, people vote not for who they think is best, but for who they think will win. And I think in this ideal self exercise, you have to do the opposite of that. You can't create an ideal self that's something that, this is what I think I can achieve. The point of creating a picture of your ideal self is almost for it to be unattainable, so that you always have a direction to move in. So that, of course, I'm not saying this is easy, because falling short is never easy, but of course you will fall short of an ideal. But I kind of think that's the point. And so I would encourage anybody who felt like they were struggling between what I want to describe as my ideal self and what I think I can achieve, to almost throw out the what I think I can achieve in favor of putting the ideal together and then identifying the steps so that you actually can achieve. And I think, to be honest, I think that's the only way that you can achieve more than you thought you could achieve, is by aiming higher than you think you can get. So I tried to make that point last week, and I know there are many ways to make that point, but I hope that resonates with people. I hope that makes sense. I hope my analogy made sense. I know that felt like a tangent, but
And Chase, if you might mind if I put something on that, I think
sure.
Some of the things that came to my mind when you were saying that is, it's important that these are like your own goals, because when you feel like there are things that society or other people put on you, lofty goals can be not so healthy. And it's the difference between being told what to do and deciding to do it. And that's the thing. I'm not going to fall into, being upset with myself if I don't achieve the thing I set up to do. But if somebody else told me to do it and I failed, the kind of emotions that would follow would be all negative. Whereas it would be reflective if I would set it up for myself as a kind of a test. So I think the fact is that the more we can take for ourselves to create our own direction and change those emotions from trying to have people tell us in what direction and how high we're supposed to go, and turn that around and have it be our own goal, that I think that's one of the ways that we can become more successful. Because when you fail in this context, you're excited because now you know how to, and we're going to talk about this, how to do better next time. Instead of just feeling, I failed them, I did poorly, I should have done better. It can be a totally different mindset.
Yeah, and how do you know if your goal is something that society has set you up to think is your goal or your own? Well, maybe there's a podcast episode about thinking your own thoughts that you should go back to. That was one of the previous principles. I think that we should go ahead and go into the next principle. We're about halfway through here. I think that's a good amount. Anybody else who has done the exercise and would like to share, there will be plenty of time in the breakout rooms. And I encourage you to share. I encourage you to get some feedback on your picture of your ideal self and use this as a continually evolving project. For anybody that has not done it yet, I would recommend doing it. It was a positive experience for me. So, all right. So this week's topic, this week's principle: analyze temporary defeat, no matter of what nature or cause, and extract from it the seed of an equivalent advantage. Now that's set up as an imperative. There's another formation of it in the book that, and it's formed a couple of different ways, and I've heard it many different ways, but it's something like, in every disadvantage, there is the seed of equivalent advantage, or in every adversity, there is the seed of equivalent advantage. So, what is temporary defeat as opposed to permanent? Why would this be framed in this way? Analyze temporary defeat. Alex, any thoughts on temporary defeat?
I mean, it seems to me it's just a permanent defeat is something that is no learning amount could take back what you lost. And like, for example, I think it would be a mindset change, right? So it'd have to destroy your mind in a way that you wouldn't be able to come back and grow from it. You'd have to have some type of defeat that damaged you in a way that growth just wasn't going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, the only permanent defeat I can think of is death, but I can also see maybe even wasting time. But so, okay.
Well, for example, some traumatic experience, psychological harm, which just happens to, or physical harm, that just makes somebody disabled from, obviously, of course, in any of these situations, maybe there's a way to get around it. You can change what you're looking for. You can find a way to incorporate it. But my point is that going to happen, I guess?
Yeah, and that's back to the practical versus theoretical question that you and I tend to talk about. Mm-hmm. So I think about the way that, well, okay, so a couple of things there. First, I think we should separate out finding the seed of equivalent advantage from defeat and erasing the experience of defeat. Because you mentioned, trauma or traumatic damage. And I don't think this principle says everything can be undone. I was listening to somebody recently who was talking about this idea of an undue function in life, that a lot of young people who have grown up with computers also have the idea that in life you can undo something, like you can undo some sort of harm by reparation. And that's actually a relatively new idea that a lot of older people don't think of it that way. They think of restoration rather than undoing, right? And that's not undoing damage, that's restoring, or that's finding the seed of equivalent advantage. And I think that especially in the case of something like psychological trauma or traumatic injury or disease or something like that, this principle is not claiming that you can undo the harm from those things. It's saying those things do not have to be a net negative on your life. That for whatever negative effect they had, you can extract equivalent advantage. But extraction is also not easy. So I think that's an important point to make here. Did you want to say anything about that before I move on to my next question?
No, I would agree. I just want to, I guess I want to make the point that I feel like whenever any type of self-help type topic is addressed, I always have the urge to point out the practicality of certain things and the exposure to the right people, communities, information, and at the right times creates the ability to have the discussion that we're having and to take these seeds of equivalent advantage from defeat. So it's almost that thing. It's almost like that urge that I have to fight people when they say, "Oh, just pull yourself up by your bootstraps," right? And I'm like, you need to have certain things in place to be able to do that. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess there's a certain compartmentalization that I have when I talk about these things,
Mm-hmm.
with the supposition that not everybody is at the right time and place to be able to deal with that. So that's just my caveat, and
Sure.
I can let go of it.
And I think that's compatible. I don't think that.
I agree.
I think that's compatible with what we're saying. I got 2 messages in the chat. Yeah. So Julie mentioned the advantage can be that you are stronger. I totally agree. I think that for many defeats, the advantage is you have the experience of getting back up, and maybe defeat is. I like adversity in the place of defeat, because often, there are things that I would consider adverse that I would not consider defeats, where had I not had the wherewithal to extract some advantage, they would only have been adverse. And there are things like that I've put myself through on purpose that you know what I'm thinking of. So a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, Alex and I did a 50-mile essentially hike event in 19 hours and 5 minutes. And that was physically probably the most adversity that I've ever gone through. And I think that, there's so much to be gained psychologically from having gone through voluntarily an event like that. To be honest, I think that's why we did it.
Yeah, that's my biggest example of that, because I feel like it's taken a year and a half for me to extract the seed of equivalent advantage, right?
Yeah.
Because that sucked, right? Those last 10 hours were pretty awful,
You're welcome.
Yeah.
So there's a principle that I want to move into here that, and it's the principle of taking ownership. I think this is especially hard in personal defeat or personal adversity, or in like a team leadership type setting. But I want to talk about the role of taking ownership in the face of defeat. I think often we have this psychological response to defeat where, we all know what I'm getting at here. The idea of taking ownership for defeat shifts the locus of control inward. And it's that stoic principle of, rather than like blaming outside forces on things that I'm feeling disturbed by, let me shift the control to me, and first of all identify what's in my control and what's not. Take ownership of the fact that if there were things in my control that I could have done differently, that I didn't, and now this is the situation. But more specifically, what can I do now in light of those facts? And I think that's extracting advantage. I think the idea of taking ownership, I think that's a really salient point. I think everybody hopefully knows what I mean when I say taking ownership of something. Like your team at work loses some sales that they thought they had. What do? Do you blame the guy who forgot the client's name? Do you blame your boss for not setting things up right? Do you blame the person that you were in charge of for not following your instructions? No. You take ownership. You say, I should have given better instructions to the person beneath me. I should have given better information up to the people in charge of me. I should have been more aware of my coworkers and checking in to make sure that the client-specific details that we're working on, everybody's on the same page with. those are things that you can control. And even if you cannot control the past, which, I'm not saying ruminate, that's a totally different thing. Even if you can't control the past, what you can do is use that knowledge and use that ownership analysis of failure to change how you fail and ultimately succeed in the future. And that's something that takes a lot of practice. That's something that's definitely not easy. I know Jeff, for example, has a bunch of, not to call you out, Jeff, don't worry, I'm not calling on you, has a bunch of experience training and teaching leaders. And he and I have had conversations about leadership and this principle of ownership, and just how much this is such an important principle in the team setting. Well, it's also an important principle in the personal setting. You can do that exact same thing of taking ownership for things in your own life. And I think that's how you extract advantage from adversity. I think to me, that's the biggest mechanism. I mean, are there other tools or mechanism that you can think of to do that are effective?
Well, yeah, I think we have whole systems set up to encourage and facilitate this learning from defeat. For example, the whole premise of teacher-student relationships in education is set up to create adversity in mental or whatever type of tasks you're doing, cognitively difficult things, in which the student is participating in it and hopefully failing at some things. And there's a mentor there to help guide them and show them what these seeds of advantage are, to help point them towards what they need to learn from it. And I think a lot of people talk about school should teach you how to learn, not just all these arbitrary facts, right? And I think that's kind of what they're getting at. We should learn by example from teachers and by assimilating from our peers and from community to how to, when we fail or face adversity or need to solve something, how to find what's relevant to learn from it and what's irrelevant, what needs to change and what needs to stay the same. Is it just a dice roll and we just happen to roll a bad dice and actually nothing needs to change? It's just, that's how reality is. Some things don't work out. Is there something we could do better? Is there something that we're totally blind to? And having another person to help you have an extra pair of eyes, especially somebody who's experienced in the topic or the area, is super useful. So I guess, do you have any intuitions about how we learn to do that for ourselves? Because I agree 100% with the taking ownership. And the more stuff you take ownership and responsibility for, the more failure and adversity you can have, and the more you can learn and grow. Yeah, but how do we point out which nuggets to take out and which are not as important?
I think that's where, in my opinion, the importance of having other people in your life that you're working with and around comes into play. I think that when you have people who, to be honest, this is what friends are for, to help you to go. I'm going to go back to some Daniel Kahneman terminology, system 1 and system 2. Your reactions, your automatic thinking is system 1. System 2 is your deliberate, more slow thinking. A lot of times our reactions and scripts in response to failure are system 1 processes. And in order to learn from them, you need your system 2 to kick in. However, unless you already have the habit of shuffling things from system 1 to 2, which even if you have that habit, it's not going to be perfect. You need other people to reflect back to you what your system 1 is doing so that you can put it into system 2 and think about it. You need people to reflect back to you what your reactions and actions and interaction with the world looks like from another perspective so that you can sort of system 2-ize it, reflect on it, and make those adjustments, extract the advantage. So, whatever in whatever capacity you can, getting feedback from the outside world, from friends, mentors, anybody, any opportunity you have to do that, I think is very important. I want to open up before we do the exercise. I want to open up to the audience. If anybody has a question about this topic or questions, they're the two kinds of questions only. Number one, questions about what we just talked about from us. And number two, questions for discussion in the breakout rooms. So questions only if people have them. We'll start with Shrikant.
I had a question about the terminology. The defeat, that word defeat, implies failure and a failure of an action combined with kind of an internal sense that I have been defeated. So I very much prefer the term failure because it puts the focus on the particular action and it drives attention to this. So do you think that defeat or failure a better way of thinking about this issue?
Yeah, I think that actually may depend on who is taking this in. And that's why I mentioned the term adversity, because I think it rings easiest for me when you substitute the word adversity. So that would be analyze temporary adversity, no matter of what nature or cause. And in your wording, analyze temporary failure, no matter what nature or cause. I agree with you. Failure internalizes it and makes it easier to sort of have that light switch moment when it happens and go, oh, right, this is failure. This feels like failure. I need to analyze it and extract the seed of advantage. If you're just talking defeat, that feels like something that happens to you. Yeah, I think I see what you're saying. I agree. I'd be curious to see what other people resonate with in terms of terminology.
Failure, I agree with Shrikant. I think failure resonates more. Defeat seems more. I feel like even just the fact that he had to specify temporary defeat kind of makes that point, and not just defeat, because like Shrikant said, I think that's very internalizing and potentially long-term or significant, when I think failure encompasses a lot more.
Yeah. All right. Stephen, you're back on.
Hey, for Alex, I think you mentioned that the more ownership you take for what happens to you, the more you can experience failure. So isn't that only possible if you're honest with yourself? And if so, how does that play a role?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. You have to really keep that principle in mind, and not let a larger volume of failure trickle into your life and start to make you cynical or anything about what's going on. But I think the point I made is important from earlier about it being a self propelled goal, right? Like these responsibilities you take them on voluntarily. So you're asking for it. And the fact that as long as you don't lie to yourself and convince yourself that you didn't ask for them once you fail, does that answer your question?
Sort of, but it seems like failure is an integral part of what Napoleon Hill is talking about, or what we're talking about here. And I'm obviously, like I said earlier, we're human and we're going to make mistakes, but I'm not too sure how that plays a role in achieving success or becoming a better person.
I see. Okay. Yeah. So I'll just use my personal example. The more responsibilities, even in a work setting, I take on, the more little things I'm going to learn, because the more little things I'm going to mess up, right? Oh, I didn't realize I had to do this thing before I did that thing. I've learned something. I understand a larger slice of the pie now. I'm broadening my understanding. I'm seeing more of the types of failures other people experience in different roles, and I can start to learn from them for myself. And that's what I think it is. It's a broadening and just like a expanding web of learning that opens you up, whereas I would have no idea otherwise.
Right.
Okay, thanks.
Next up is Kaiten.
Oh, hello. Excuse me. Yeah, so sorry, I'm having some audio visual issues.
We can hear
Um,
you fine if you want to go ahead with your question.
yeah, I'm sorry for the delay. My question was the temporary failure issue. Do you think that in an idealistic scenario, you progress in a linear fashion? You're just, linear, right? And then you have this other one where you have these uh, failures along the way. It's like kind of an oscillatory linear path going up. So do you think that the linear straight path, straight arrow, no failures is the preferred way, or having all these little adjustments, failures, resets, going back a little, going forward, is the better course in terms of like, human experience, I guess. You know what I mean?
I have a great analogy for that. And this, I'm only going to explain my answer by analogy. And again, this is one I'm curious to hear what other people think. So, a dog without teeth is not a nice dog. It's a dog that doesn't have the opportunity to be mean or nice. It has no teeth. A dog with teeth that is nice to you has the opportunity to be nice. I think life with success with no failure is sort of empty success. I think that there's some value to the struggle aspect of it, the failure aspect of finding success. Maybe that analogy was slightly off, but
Yeah,
that's all
I think
got.
that's spot on. That's exactly what I would have. I just had it as like if you're not failing, you're not doing difficult enough things. It's like you're not challenged, right? If you're in school and it's too easy, you go to the AP classes, right? And then maybe you do a little, fail a little bit. So I think your potential is too high, and that was a struggle for me. I would set the bar too low so that I didn't have to experience failure and suffer with those emotional repercussions. And therefore, I grew significantly more slowly.
Yeah. It's also, if you are not experiencing failure, I think that actually is a failure in and of itself, and it's a failure to reach. If you're moving smoothly and seeming to find success with no adversity or challenges, I think that's a failure of reach. I don't think you're reaching high enough. So with that, yeah. Okay. I want to get through a couple more questions. Kevin and gang, you guys are it for questions, and then we will move on to the exercise. We'll do the breakout rooms, discussion, bada bing, bada boom. It'll be good. Kevin.
Oh, thank you, Chaz. I got a little bit different perspective. I would get you guys input. I would understand life is a journey of learning. It's not just competition. If I learn from it, either failure or success, I will be always a winner rather than a loser.
Mm-hmm.
So no one can defeat me unless I give up or admit it's my failure. What's your guys?
Yeah, and that's a I think that's compatible. I think that's an attitude shift. I don't think that's incompatible with what we're saying. I mean, that's almost the automatic attitude version of what we're saying, that like win or lose, if you're learning, you're winning. Well, that's what we're saying. Like win or lose, learn from it. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you're already there. I mean, in some sense. All right, gang.
Yeah, I think this is quite similar to what we learned. A landmark is talking about break through and break down. Every time you break through, then you will break down at a certain point. And it's just like Jordan Peterson talking about where the growth point is between the order and chaos. And when we challenge ourselves at that boundary, that's a growth area. If we don't challenge ourselves, if we never have any failure, then that means you're not challenging enough. But I think the culture is don't challenge yourself too much, so you you cannot recover. So you still have to between the lines. So I really enjoyed this talk. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, let's go through the exercise for this week, and I'm going to give you guys 2 pieces of it that are, not written on the meetup page. And I'm trying to decide whether we should keep this, just for the people who make it through the whole discussion. It'll be, maybe we'll make it public. We'll see. Either way, you guys are the exclusive test audience. So let me read the exercise first, and then I'll give you the new part. So the exercise goes as follows. Find an example of defeat or failure from your life and analyze it using one or both of the following systems. And then identify the seed of equivalent advantage. And I give 2 analysis systems. There's sort of a post-mortem method for analyzing defeat, failure, adversity, which is, why did I get the result that I did? You can ask why down to 5 levels. What could I have done differently? And what could I commit to in light of this? Action steps. And then there's the 3 piles method. And this, I learned this from actually backpacking. So when you go on a backpacking trip, you're trying to save weight, especially if you're doing ultralight backpacking. And so it's really important to do this analysis after your trip to make sure that you're not overpacking or underpacking. But when you unpack your bag, you put all of your gear into 3 piles. And you can do this with analyzing, some sort of failure. So pile 1 is, what did I bring on the trip with me that really helped? So, even though I have failed or faced adversity, what tools did I bring to the table? What attitudes did I come with that actually helped me and maybe made it so that my failure wasn't as bad as it could have been? So this is the good pile, or the helpful pile. That's actually a better term for it. This is the helpful pile. And then, what did I bring on my trip? This is back to the backpacking analogy. What did I bring on my trip that I didn't use at all? It was just extra weight, and I didn't need it, and I don't need to bring it next time. So for failure, that could be something like, what did I do that I caused some of my own failure here? I caused myself to experience more adversity than I needed to. So that's pile number 2. And then pile number 3 is, what did I do that didn't necessarily help me, but that I'm going to keep doing? And now in backpacking, this is like your contingency plans. This is putting extra things in place, like your first aid kit that you didn't end up using, but you should probably bring a first aid kit backpacking, right? So, and I think that may be the hardest step with failure. And that's sort of an advanced analysis. You don't even necessarily need to have that pile, but for our purposes, that pile is, what did I do that didn't help me, but that I will continue to do? So maybe it didn't hurt me, or it only hurt me a little bit, but the fact that I had my backup plan, the fact that I had my contingency or whatever it was, is something that I will do again. And now here's the secret portion of it that I think is going to make this week doing this exercise a little bit better. Try to voluntarily face something that you can put through this analysis this week. Try to find something that is a little extra adverse, or a little extra failure-y for you to do this week, and then immediately after, go through this analysis. Now, this is going to start to feel, if anybody's ever done CBT for something like social anxiety, this is going to start to feel like the social anxiety CBT technique of like going out and exposing yourself to something that makes you anxious, and then immediately analyzing things like thought patterns and behaviors in the moment that were helpful or not helpful. It may feel a lot like that, but this is with failure, any failure. So this is the super secret special part. Go and volunteer for this. And if you do that and you come next week and you say, I did the super secret special version where I volunteered for an experience of failure this week and I analyzed it, I'm going to put you first in line to talk about it if you want. So that's the exercise. And here's what we'll do. Let's all go through it really quickly. I'll guide you through it. We're going to do it in 5 minutes. And then we're going to discuss our results of our sort of first round tests of this in the breakout rooms. So 5 minutes on the timer. Hopefully everybody learned from last week to have something with which to write and on which to write. And brainstorm for this first 30 seconds. What is an example from my life of defeat or failure or adversity? Could be recent, could be less recent. I think if it's a longer time away, you should pick something major. But some experience of adversity. All right, I've got one. I wrote it down. Hopefully you do too. If not, you can catch up. And I'm going to choose this 3 piles method. If you're choosing the other method, good luck. This is my favorite. So pile number 1, what did I do that helped me? Now I'm answering that question real quick. We're going to get done with this faster than 5 minutes. You'll see. It's easy. All right, we're going to move on to the next question. You can always go back and add more. What did I do that hurt me in this? All right. And in the last minute and a half, either what did I do that didn't help me, but that I will continue to do, or switch to one of the questions from the other method and see if that's more helpful for you. All right. 5 minutes. I don't know about you guys, but I had more to write. It's hard to complete in 5 minutes, but I at least got something, and I feel like I already benefited from it. So here's what we're going to do. We will split into breakout rooms, and the topic for discussion is, what did you get from this exercise? And if you're going to do this super secret, sneaky special version and volunteer for some failure this week, maybe discuss some plans for how you can approach it, where you can find some failure, and how you can almost pre-plan your extracting seeds of advantage. So with that, thank you everyone for once again coming and listening to The Switch. Thank you to everyone listening to this as it goes out on YouTube and in the podcast version. Really appreciate being able to do this. I love outwitting the devil. I love having these conversations, and I love talking with you guys about them. So until next time.